Any luck there? Oh,
I've just got a text from Rob saying whenever I'm ready, so I'm going to assume that he's made it work.
Okay, great. Well, let's get started, and I
yeah.
guess I might switch on later. Okay, thanks, everyone.
Can I please ask up the first affirming speaker to start today's debate?
Point where you are living in an illiberal state, constantly oppressed and persecuted by your nation, never having the voice to stand up for your rights, while the elites in your state make you poor. That is the point where liberal actors have the duty and an obligation to liberalize these states and reduce the economic influence to condemn these apparent actions. A few things today. First, set up two second substantives, one on benefits to liberal nations, and a second on how we get more liberal actors in the world. Firstly, on framing, what do we think liberal actors look like? A few characteristics, two characteristics of what we think these look like. Firstly, they follow liberal ideals internally. This looks like having an impartial justice system, a free trade and free speech regulations within their country. Secondly, we think that this means they project international illiberal. Secondly, we think they project liberal values on the international stage. This means that they uphold and defend liberal principles, for example, preserving territorial integrity and being or belonging to international governing bodies such as the UN or the World Trade Organization. Generally, we think this is true generally because these institutions were formed by liberal nations. So, for example, US, Canada, New Zealand, and Switzerland. Secondly, we think illiberal states are characterized by a couple of factors. Firstly, we think that these illiberal nations are often breaching international standards. We think this looks like disrespect of territorial integrity in the South China Sea by China. Or secondly, Pakistan not following the conditions of their nuclear arms deal. Secondly, we think that these countries are extensively abusive, and we think this looks kind of like genocide on the extreme end, genocide by the Chinese government against Uyghur Muslims, or Rwandan government using tax dollars to buy swimming pools for their president. Thirdly, we think that these countries are often generally against democratic norms and principles. This means they don't have democratic elections in their countries, for example, Sudan or Congo. What do we think dependence looks like? So we think this means often that liberal nations are full of natural resources, and liberal nations are buying these natural resources from these countries. So what do we think reducing dependence on these illiberal nations actually looks like? We think this looks like a gradual waning of dependence over a few years. We think that this means, like, for example, Germany stops getting its oil from Russia and starts getting it from Canada. And it means that we move like subsidies on the imports and other things related to that. So on to our first standard, why we get more liberal actors when it comes to our side of the world. Firstly, we think that a little bit of context, we think that the largest economic trade centers are located in liberal countries. This looks like London in the UK or New York City in the US. This is because global standards are often centered in these liberal nations and cannot be replicated in illiberal nations. These can't be replicated in illiberal nations because liberal nations have various properties that allow investors to be confident when they keep their capital there. This looks like having things like property rights, a justice system that means your company is not going to be taken over by the communist government anytime soon, or checks and balances. Three mechanisms for why we get more liberal actors on our side of the house. Firstly, we think that when we reduce dependence on these illiberal nations, we cause detrimental harm to the economy. This causes backlash and results in two things. Firstly, we allow citizens to realize the harm that is being created by their government. And secondly, even if these citizens do not attribute harm to the government, people generally blame the government for their suffering. At our best, we get government overthrow, but even at the worst, we get citizens' unrest, which undermines the government. Note that most revolutions are caused when the price of bread or other essential items get too expensive for the citizens. Second mechanism for this, we think that influences on liberal states are multidimensional. This looks like oligarchs or cartels that have sizable control over the government and the government structure in those countries. If these oligarchs and cartels are losing money, they're going to put a lot of pressure on the government to change their ways and to become a bit more liberal and to allow them to continue making money. Thirdly, third mechanism for this, we think it undermines government funding. When we get less money coming into these governments through trade, it means they can't fund their military, they can't fund their propaganda, and the government begins to fail. And a lot of the public pressure that I talked about earlier begins to mount on the government to change their ways. So what are the outcomes of this? It means we get more liberal actors on our side of the house, which is good because because we get less harmful actors and more liberals due to suffering within these illiberal nations. This looks like, for example, East Germany becoming part of Germany when the Berlin Wall fell, because people in East Germany saw how well West Germany was doing. Firstly, before I move on, I'll take a POI.
At the point in time where states like China and Russia actively censor all of the media, how are average citizens able to hold the government account when it's probably going to be twisted to make them seem like the liberal states are the villains?
Okay, so when you can't afford to buy bread or milk, it doesn't matter what the media is saying. It doesn't matter who's lying to you because you can't afford to buy bread. And so you realize the reality of what is going on. Second substantive, why we give benefits to liberal nations. 4 mechanisms for this. Firstly, trade. We think that when you reduce your dependence on these illiberal nations, you trade more with liberal nations. It means that this looks like Germany buying oil from Canada rather than Russia. It means that you do this or you bring in a substitute. It means that you import LNG instead of natural gas from Russia or other illiberal countries. This continues to strengthen, means we can continue successful initiatives that these liberal countries are forwarding. Secondly, we get internal economic benefits from to these liberal nations. This means when you have less trade with bad nations, it means you have to produce more stuff at home. This means more jobs and more economic growth within these liberal countries. Third mechanism, we get greater stability within these countries. It means that your economy is less susceptible to what Putin is doing. For example, the inflation crisis in the United States right now, which is caused a lot by Russia and the Russian war in Ukraine. When you're dependent on these countries, it means your economy is a lot more stable, it's easier to plan, which increases business investment throughout the years. Fourthly, we get better global relations. This means when there are more liberal countries, it means it's just easier to negotiate and easier to find trade deals, etc. Firstly, what are the outcomes of this? We get better outcomes for liberal countries and further benefits to international groups, which allows us to further these successful initiatives that international groups have begun in the first place. At the point where illiberal economies are benefiting due to the decreased dependence on illiberal countries, it becomes more beneficial to become a liberal nation. I mean, you're going to get more countries that are acting in a liberal way and are actually forwarding liberal ideas and principles on the global stage. So, at the end of this case, we've proven that not only we get that governments in illiberal countries cannot afford and cannot replicate the economic centers that illiberal countries can, but also this liberal countries waning their dependence means you get less stability in these illiberal countries, leading to more liberal countries, which is better off for our world overall. Proud to propose.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that speech. I now invite up the first negating speaker to open their team's case.
Okay. 3, 2, 1. You want to talk about civilian suffering. Let's talk about when a single mother cannot afford baby formula because petrol is too expensive. Let's talk about when a Russian civilian cannot access insulin because of sanctions. We tell you today that we will win this day's debate because the F's comparative causes more harm on our side of the house. So firstly, I'll be talking, firstly, I'll go into a bit of rebuttal. I'll talk about the fallibility of F comparative. I will talk about the economic harms. I'll talk about political harms, and yeah, on to some rebuttal. So firstly, we heard from the affirming team that because of the backlash from this ceasing of trade in these illiberal countries, the civilians will realize the harms, right? They'll realize the harms of the government. Once they can't afford bread, they'll go, oh, it must be my government screwing me over. And so because of that, they're going to cause a great amount of backlash. 4 responses for this. First, we'll tell you, if all it took was civilian suffering and civilian backlash to change these countries, they would have already changed. These civilians are suffering. Secondly, they already cannot afford bread. They already are suffering within these states. And it is not their suffering that is going to cause tangible change to this illiberal government. Thirdly, we tell you that simply what this illiberal government does is they villainize the liberal state. This is what North Korea does. They say the reason you're suffering right now is because America sucks and America is doing all these bad things, and you have to stick with us because America is the terrible villain and you must hate them. So actually, it causes more disparity, more hatred, and more. No, sorry, I won't take it. But fourthly, around censorship, these governments in these illiberal states are already so censored anyway. This information is not traveling in any tangible way. These civilians cannot even communicate with each other in this way to cause this uproaring or this backlash. We heard, secondly, of course, that when illiberal countries cannot fund the military or they cannot fund their bad things, they will simply turn liberal. What we tell you 2 responses here. First of all, this is untrue in that the vindication and anger experienced by these illiberal states will simply cause them to become more violent. There will be more money towards the military. There will be more vindication and more resentment towards liberal states. But secondly, we will see that they essentially get pushed into a corner, and illiberal states will having to be more reliant on each other. For example, Russia and China might have to be more reliant on each other, which is a tangibly a bad effect for illiberal nations as a whole, when these illiberal nations are forced to make alliances. The rest of my rebuttal will be integrated into my case. So firstly, let's talk about the fallibility of F's comparative, why this doesn't work. Firstly, liberal states control most of the natural resources. We heard this at F actually. This looks like Russia and Saudi Arabia controlling oil, China controlling minerals and gold and aluminium. And that this will be vastly more expensive when we cut ties of trade with these nations. But secondly, that liberal countries are too reliant on illiberal countries, and that we are supremely reliant on China. For example, the clothes I'm wearing right now were made in China. The computer with which you talked to me through was made in China. No, sorry, I will not take that. And that we see that the outcome is that once we reduce this trade, we absolutely feel the economic bite. Now, of course, we heard from the affirming team that what they're going to do is they're just going to instead go to places like Canada for oil. They're going to transition over, to which we tell you none of the liberal countries can produce these natural resources as cheaply as, say, China. It simply does not work economically. And what we'll see instead is that prices for these things will skyrocket. No, thank you. But we tell you, because of this economic pressure, there is only a limited amount of time that we can uphold any sanctions as liberal states to these illiberal countries. And what we need is long-term. We ask, what is needed for political change, right? Firstly, you need long-term political sanctions. You need long-term ceasing of trade. This can't be just oh no, a little bit and then gone. But secondly, you need every single liberal country, right, to absolutely stop this for it to have any tangible effect. Because even if one breaks, if Germany keeps trading with Russia and with oil and stuff, they've still got that trade link. So the sanction doesn't work, correct? Thirdly, it needs to be targeted, and fourthly, it needs to be upheld. We tell you instead that things establishing relationships and keeping soft power dynamics over these illiberal states is more effective. Yes, I'll take that POI.
Do you acknowledge that illiberal states cannot replicate the type of economic dependency that liberal states can, and so the trade will be severely hurt if they were to go with these sanctions? Thank you.
We tell you that we, as Western liberal states, we depend on this kind of relationship, this trade relationship, where we can get these natural resources from these countries. And I'll go into more into this, why we actually depend on this, and why we simply cannot phase into just using Canada for oil. But onto the point of economics. Firstly, consumers in liberal countries are significantly worse off. Let's actually talk about what this looks like, all right? You want to talk about morals? We tell you about once we impose a sanction on, say, like Saudi Arabia or Iran, that's no more oil, right, from them. That's every liberal country experiencing no more oil. That has immediate, bitterly tangible effects. And like this is high school supply and demand, right? Supply drops, demand increases, prices skyrocket. But what does this look like? This looks like the single mother who can't afford petrol unless she stops buying her baby formula. But this economic pressure means she has to choose whether she eats tonight or her kids eat. We tell you then like sanctions on China, this is the cost of materials increasing tenfold. Here, you have right in front of you like a mother who cannot buy shoes for her child. Like we're going into the winter, it is bitterly cold and the shoes have holes in them and she simply cannot function. Like this is now like a liberal Western country because of these sanctions or because of the ceasing of trade, we see these tangible harms. You want to talk about suffering, here it is, right? But then we tell you like producers in those countries are worse off as well. They have like a smaller market to sell to and they will not be able to feed their families. But this looks like dairy farmers in New Zealand, completely reliant on selling to China. We tell you when New Zealand ceases their trade with dairy products with China, New Zealand is like screwed over, but China doesn't experience a thing. China is not harmed by that whatsoever. But finally, this looks like all countries having less economic trade. So they are worse off and have slower economic growth. This means like simply like everyone is poorer. Like tangibly, this is a harm that we see like exclusively on our side of the house. No, I will not take that pill, I thank you. And these effects are especially bad for illiberal countries and producers because their governments are less likely to support them, correct? And then finally, we tell you for the civilians in these countries, like sanctions to Russia, this looks like insulin and like hormone replacement like drugs being stopped. Because like Putin is not harmed by this. Putin is not harmed when you like cease you having McDonald's in Russia. However, like fresh fruit, life-saving medication, this is what human suffering looks like for those civilians in these countries. We're told that liberal states want to uphold liberal ideals, and this is like direct human suffering that we experience instead. Finally, on politics, we tell you this point proves that side F only increases economic tension and decreases leverage power. Firstly, because there is less peaceful communication. The comparative here is that we could diplomatically talk and convince China to do things on their side, they leave them to do what they want. Secondly, people in liberal countries no longer support or care, and because they're really mad, they have to choose between taking their kids to school or like going to work because of petrol prices. They are like now mad at this. But finally, escalation. Now side F has more global superpowers, very mad, for example, Russia, and Russia does not respond rationally. The outcomes are, of course, increased tension and significant harms on their side of the house, which is why we are firmly on this debate. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that speech. I now invite up the second affirming speaker to continue their team's case.
I'll come back and grab it 1 second. Look, I think side negating faces a significant challenge in today's debate because their case materials all rely on large economies like Russia and China being what this debate's about. No, we flagged at first that the actually important bit of this debate was also just tangibly the small countries that were really, really important in this debate, the smaller liberal nations that were going to be so debate changing. Look, we probably weren't going to shift China and Russia in this debate. They probably were never going to shift it all on either side of the house. What was going to shift was these small liberal nations that looked like in Africa, in like Central Asia. Those were the kind of nations we were talking about. What am I going to do for you today? I'm going to do 3 things for you. Firstly, I'm going to look at our case for us, what still stands for it, and rebuild it. Secondly, I'm going to engage with their material. Thirdly, going to bring you a split on why we reduce international conflict in the debate today. Okay,
Okay, I think the key clash today is just like the impact on like illiberal nations. What's our thrust on this on prop today? What's our material? We tell you we liberalize these actors because of a couple of things. We tell you the trade hubs are centered in the West because of things like the USD being the standardized trading currency in the world, because of things like it being very important to like, you know, be a trading hub, because London has legitimacy as a trading hub in the same way that Saudi Arabia doesn't, because when the Saudi Arabia prince gets mad, he just like strips people of their assets and puts them behind bars, right? We tell you this massively harms their economy, right? And because of this, people feel tangibly impacted. What's their response material we get to this? We tell you, they're like, but propaganda is going to be, you know, in the media, because they control the state media, is going to massively mean they don't even realize that it's you. It's going to turn this harm on top of you. What's our response to this? Couple of things. Firstly, we tell you that the economic harm is still going to create unrest. Even if you're able to sell the public and say, this is just because the West hates us, right? They're still going to be like, yeah, but why can't you fix it? Make them not hate us, right? Like, people aren't the most like logical beings ever, right? They often like, although you can like for some extent make them feel that, we think to some level they're probably going to be upset with you because they're not that rational, and they believe that you're the like high and mighty government who engages with those nations, and because of that they think that you should engage and should fix that issue. Also, like to note that this media control only exists in nations, once again, like China and Russia, who have like these big media state controls, right? We tell you this doesn't exist in the smaller nations, which we've been talking about on our bench so far. Also, we think the internet undermines this. I can be in China, like all I have to do is like flick on a VPN, right? And all that does is it mitigates all of the state like regulation on that. So that's our response to that. Also, they tell us it undermines, we told you it undermines government initiatives. They told us it didn't impact Putin. That was their response to that. And I'm like, maybe not directly, because Putin protects his assets in other ways, but what it does do is it undermines government initiatives, it undermines the public, it creates unrest. All of those things are indirect factors that impact him. Also, we brought you benefits to liberal actors, which also was the countervailing pull towards liberal actors. We brought you things like trade, like internal economic benefit, things like that. They didn't have any responses to this, right? Let's move into their material. What's their case thrust today? They tell us that we're very reliant on places like China and Russia. Look, firstly, that's exactly the issue of this debate today. That's why we need to pull away, right? We tell you that like, that's exactly why we need to like have this pull away, because the harms to people when Russia like cuts off oil to Germany is like actually very significant, right? We tell you those harms are not something we have control over. On our side of the house, we at least have some control because we've modeled in that we're going to have a slow pull away from these actions. We're able to like start to scale up things. Like, for example, the US is currently only using 20% of its like natural gas reserves. We're able to utilize more of that, scale up things like that to solve these issues. They're like, yes, but Canada's not going to be as affordable as Russia. Yeah, that's probably because they're not using like slave labor and abusing human rights and paying people like 2 cents an hour. That's probably like a pretty problematic thing on their side of the house, and they're actually massively detrimental. If as a consumer, I have to pay a little bit more, that's probably like a slight harm that can be mitigated by like upscaling and economies of scale and technology in the long run. But we're literally stopping people just being like just abused, like, and their human rights being undermined. Also, they want to tell us that you need all liberal nations to go in if this is to work. Like, if even one breaks, that's going to break the chain. Note, that's probably not true. You just need a majority, right? They didn't give us any reasoning behind that. I'm going to give you analysis for why that's true. It's because the economic harms still extend. Maybe they're not as significant, but they probably still exist to some extent. It just mitigates our benefits slightly. Note, why is it that we're likely to have all liberal nations and lots of them follow us? 2 reasons for you. Firstly, we tell you they're generally united in their incentives. Also, we tell you there's generally like pressure in international organizations for these guys to generally operate together. Generally Europe, generally USA, they generally follow the same line on policy, on voting bloc in United Nations and things like that. Also, we think that there's domestically just pressure on them because these countries are really horrible. Like in the US, like people are like, the war in Ukraine is like so terrible, right? So they want to put pressure on them. People are like, the Uyghur Muslim genocide is literally horrific. We're happy to take a little bit of suffering for that to happen. We tell you that's massively harmful. So that's pretty much all our material that they brought out today. We're able to sufficiently take that down. We're able to sufficiently say that our case is propped up in today's debate. I'll take a POI from them now if they've got one.
Why is 3 years a sufficient, or just a few years, as your first speaker said, a sufficient amount of time to transition away from these countries?
Look, I wouldn't get locked into the examples of the economics. Look, I'm not an economist. I don't work in government. economic policy, right? That was just a rough gauge example, right? We tell you what that actually looks like is that's not like our burden to deal with actually specifically how that economic policy actually functions. We think you give a significant time. We think it looks like the current Germany plan to pull away from Russian oil, to pull away from their interdependence. I don't know exactly what their policy looks like, but it's something along those lines. Germany's worked out that that's going to work, and they'll still be able to provide an economic benefit to their people. Okay, what's my split material now? So my substantive contribution to this debate. Why is it that we reduce international conflict? No, this is probably pretty important and an independent path to victory. Because even if we aren't able to prove any of our other benefits, like reducing human conflict, like reducing wars in like Ukraine, that's like a massive benefit. That's just like really huge on our side of the house. A little bit of context for you. We tell you that generally liberal actors don't go to war. Why is that? Couple of mechanisms for you. Firstly, we tell you democracy, is against it generally, right? We tell you the cost of war is generally very great to the citizens of that country. They're generally unlikely to support a party that is very warmongering. Also, democratic processes and regulation generally slow down the process of going to war. So that often mitigates that harm of flash action, right? We tell you, secondly, they import things like territorial integrity. Unless they're intact, they generally don't attack. Things like NATO are defensive alliances. Also, we just like to flag that they often are very economically prosperous, right? It plays into the golden arches theory, right? We tell countries that are generally well built economically aren't going to go out and attack these nations. A couple of mechanisms for you how we improve this then, and we get less international conflict. First mechanism, funding, right? We tell you, due to the economic harms of all these sanctions to these countries, they're less able to fund their programs. We tell you that means that they have less nukes, have less weapons. The Russian economy is able to buy less tanks, revamp their military less. That probably means they're less harmful in a conflict, less likely to go to war. Secondly, we tell you that there's more liberal countries, which means there's going to be more international cooperation in the backlash towards them, which is really important. We tell you more liberal actors are now going to be pushing the same direction. You're more able to restrict and put a chokehold on their trade. We tell you that looks like we're also not caught up in the chokehold because now on our side, Germany doesn't rely on Russian oil. So that's literally what's slowing down Europe, and a lot of the sanctions coming out of there, their reactability, their ability to backlash, that's massively mitigated because they're tied up in Russian oil, their interdependence on that. When we take that away, we're able to mitigate that point. What are the outcomes of this? We literally save lives and get less war. Those are pretty sizable impacts on less death, less harms, less all the horrific things that are happening in Ukraine at the moment, right? We tell you this is an independent path to victory as we have a benefit that we prove here that's just probably significant enough to outweigh the material that's come out on their bench so far.
Great, thank you very much for that speech. I now invite up the second negating speaker to continue their team's case.
Can you guys type in chat? Okay, if you just wave, then I'll call on you, but I'll probably ask one. Panel, all of side F's material was so contingent on them proving that they had countries actually liberalizing. But what they failed to recognize was the fact that there's actually no incentive for liberal countries to liberalize these other nations because they have such few resources. They have so limited resources that the liberal country in the first place, that is you now need to engage with them, have absolutely no net benefit. And then because we told you all of those flow-on effects as to how that's so harmful for said liberal country in the first place, there was actually absolutely nothing to justify that. 4 things I'm going to do in today's speech. First, I'm going to talk about like this moral duty. Secondly, does their comparative work to actively like stop the harms? Thirdly, do they liberalize? And finally, do they like reduce international conflict? Within that, I'll be bringing in my extensions to how they only make it significantly worse. Okay, what we had first on morals was 2 things. First is that there's like this liberal duty. Look, I only think that this was true to the extent where the liberal duty doesn't actively harm this liberal country themselves. Because I don't think it's particularly liberal to force young single mothers to choose between baby formula and like driving her kids to school, or like choosing whether she's like spending that petrol money that they have on like the trip to school or the trip to work. I don't think that was particularly liberal. That was an incredible harm, and they actually get to engage with that. Because look, they told you that like, I'll deal with this more later, but they told you that like you're able to just simply go and source these things from other countries. That was simply not true, right? At the point in time where like even so far as you can source from Canada, even at the very, very best, that's probably only like 10% of the natural oil rigs that you have in places like Russia, that you have in the Middle East. And what that means is that they were never able to get enough of that oil, and it was also going to be so much more expensive. But look, in terms of morals, we probably clearly win this point anyway. At the point in time, we proved that there are just so many concrete harms to the average person, right? We proved that this probably doesn't only just happen in this liberal country in the first place. But we also said that there are probably so many harms to the people, like the people of Russia, who probably didn't even support the like nation's leader in the first place. They never actually wanted to go to war, and now they're like going to be so much worse off because the country's spending all their money on military budget. Dealing with that more later. Anyway, does the comparative work to actively pressure states to like stop in the first place? So many pushbacks on this. Firstly, this is literally the status quo in some cases, right? Because they're literally supporting the sanctions on Russia and things like that. Note here, they literally have not worked. Even our hardest sanctions have literally like allowed the war to continue. Secondly, they're not long term. What this means is that there's only so long that like we can continue to be sanctioning these places because you're like the liberal country is going to like go down and like spiral. Like it's absolutely destroying every single country's economy, right? What this means is you've probably only got about 6 months left, and then you're actually thoroughly screwed. Thirdly, held by everyone. Note the response to this was that like all you have to do is maintain a majority. Look, I don't think this is true, because look, as soon as one country leaves, that starts a trend for the other countries to do so, because there's going to be so much pressure on them, on the leaders to like go and be like make the situation better. But secondly, it just means that like as soon as one country does break, that they're going to be increasing the trade with that country in the first place. Because look, it is so important at the point in time when you realize just how dire these circumstances are, because all of these countries need these resources, and there is only so long they can live without them, because quite literally you cannot source these resources from any other place, and that is actually like burning a hole in the economy. But look, the last thing they told you was that you're going to be like united, you're going to have this unity and like pressure. I think there's actually so much worse domestic pressure from the people who are suffering these effects, for people that they never even see at the point in time where there's probably not going to be those great benefits anyway. I'll prove that why later. But look, here's why I think that this actually gets so much worse under their side of the house in terms of stopping these governments from carrying out these crimes. I'd say it only gets worse at the point in time where you no longer have a good relationship with them in terms of like keeping like checks and balances. What this looks like is them no longer letting like the UN in to conduct human rights reports. Look, the obvious pushback from them is like maybe China like hides the like bad human rights abuses. But look, at least at the point in time where like a country is incentivized to at least reduce the harms it affects, and that's probably still debate winning anyway. We are the only side that exclusively maintains that, because under their side they're like ruining the relationship and they have absolutely nothing to keep them in check. Under their side, they expose these people to heinous amounts of abuse, to absolutely no accountability. But look, let me add some substantive material here as well. When liberal countries stop trading with illiberal countries start to trade with each other and like build really, really good relationships. Why? Because most illiberal states are not self-sufficient, and that literally no state has every single resource they need to survive, and every single country needs to trade. And what this means is that you now have nations like China and Russia now like joining in unity and now creating this like massive like international super that no liberal countries can deal with. Look, F had to prove that they were able to actually like stop these crimes in the first place to stand any chance of winning, and we have so many other like we prove that at the end of that it's either symmetric because they literally make no tangible like ground, or it's only worse under their side. I will take your POI now.
So you mentioned that illiberal countries will start to trade with each other. How would a liberal country start to trade with each other if their financial institutions, your assets can be gone like that if MBS has like a fit and takes all your company assets?
Look, I don't think that's particularly important at the point in time where like all they need to do is like prove that there's like some sort of gain to both parties, and then they can like go and trade. Look, do they liberalize? That was the second thing that we're talking about here. A few mechanisms that they gave you here. Firstly, that the people are going to realize their harms. I think this was particularly interesting considering that we literally heard the opposition say that as soon as somebody tries to speak out against their country, they're put behind bars, right? What that clearly proves is that you literally don't get accountability under their side of the house. And even so far as you do realize your harms, you're immediately censored and you can't tell anybody else. And what that proves is that you literally don't get the benefits that you need. They also told you that you're able to like blame the governments, right? At the point in time where you are completely censored and the government controls every single news source, every single education source that you've been like raised on, you probably don't realize the harms of them, and the harms are always going to be pointed to somebody else. They also gave you this example of like the small African nations, and that was important because like for some reason they weren't going to have the same sort of symmetric benefit, like the same sort of mechanisms acting on them. But look, liberal countries don't want to trade with them because they are not going to be beneficial to them, and because they are so poor, because they will be like economically ruining their own country. The last thing they told us here was about less military funding. Look, quite simply, we flip the material here because the opposite is true. When they feel threatened by liberal forces, they put more money to their military. Why? Because people in charge don't care about their citizens. They have no incentive to look after them. They only care about the rich elite and they look after themselves so they can enjoy more luxurious lives. What this means is that we actually flip the material because now everyone's so much worse under their side of the house because now this country has like a limited, they might have like less they might have less money, but now this is going to be so much worse because you're now like causing millions of innocent civilians to suffer. And we probably do care about that at the point in time where like millions of people are dying because they never either supported the country in the first place or they were so brainwashed that they had no autonomy. Let me deal with the last thing about do they reduce international conflict? The essential like the mechanism they gave you is that like there's this ability to fund. Look, I don't think that's true at the point in time where like these illiberal, illiberal countries are able to like merge and trade with each other, and that probably means that they're able to like that means they're able to be like sufficiently like trade and because they have good relationships with each other, and that means that they're probably just able to like support each other and like join each other, and conflict that was only ever going to be worse. They probably also just increased military funding because they were so scared of escalation. Because why does this only ever become more harmful under their side of the house? Because you have no peaceful communication, right? The comparison here is that we could diplomatically talk or convince these like superpowers to do these things. On their side, they leave them to do exactly what they want with no checks or balances. Secondly, people in liberal countries no longer support or care about these things because they are very, very mad that they are choosing that between taking their kids to school or going to work, and that means they're never going to want to like go to war and these things, and that means that they're never like international conflict probably like isn't palatable for that country, and that means that they're never going to want to like sanction these take action against these countries. And finally, it probably just escalates it so much worse under their side of the house anyway, because now side F has like made global superpowers very mad who like have nuclear weapons and who can go and attack other countries. And what that means is that international conflict probably only gets so much worse because you've only made the people who like you have no checks and balances significantly stronger and could be proud to stand.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that speech. I now invite up the third affirmative speaker to close out their team's case. Substantive, sorry.
Pairwise, wait, my hand.
Yeah.
Pairwise, just like wave. Okay. Cool. Three things in the speech. Firstly, what happens to the economies both in illiberal nations and liberal nations. Secondly, we're going to talk about the liberalization of illiberal actors, and then finally, international conflicts and politics. Okay, but before that, an important clarification to make. Because a push from Sophie is that, oh, it's only going to be like a small amount of liberal actors doing that. Let's just clarify why that's not likely. 4 reasons. Firstly, we think there's pressure domestically from advocates within states to also come behind the initial liberal actor that does this. Secondly, international pressure exists from international advocates. Thirdly, there's often liberal alliances and like massive world organizations that pressure countries to also follow the actions of the initial liberal actor that does that. But finally, oftentimes they want that impact by their own like standing, but they didn't have the courage to do that in the first place. I think the outcome of that is that the vast majority of liberal actors are likely to follow. You set a huge precedent of standing up against these abuses, which means our impact is massive within these nations. Okay, cool. What was the material on economics here? They tell us that consumers in liberal states are going to be harmed. Oh no, actually, let me deal with the liberal states first. They tell us that illiberal states are harmed economically. We agree, but by their own analysis, subjugated communities already are economically in despair. They're already living in poverty, in destitution. The difference comes because of this policy. Because when you pressure actions that these illiberal states have done, that is when you see the elites see their nation go up in flames, when their economy cripples, when their population revolts against them, when the economic desperation comes. On liberal states, they tell us that the gradual opportunity, they tell us you harm consumers in liberal states. We tell you that that this policy was gradual, right? It gives the opportunity for industries to develop as well. Note it wasn't 3 years like Cam tried to tell us in a POI. We think it's actually more like 10 or like 15 or 20, right? We actually think it was gradual and you like slowly reduced your economic influence within those states and poured it into other states who were able to negotiate within that. So you don't get people literally missing out on insulin and the kinds of harm they wanted to talk about, but they also don't engage with the 4 mechanisms we gave in our second substantive as to why you actually get further economic benefits to those liberal nations. Told you that firstly, you're likely to get more trade, things like internal economic benefits and greater stability through better global relations on producers in liberal states. Obviously, again, that is gradual, so they can break into new markets, they can do things like that. But I think it's really critical here to acknowledge that you knock out the competitive producers for illiberal actors. Note why that on balance is likely to cancel them out, because often markets from illiberal states, as Elliot rightly points out, can do really shady practices, which means their goods are always likely to be the most affordable because they've done the most shady things in order to produce those goods in the first place, because they're not conforming to international standards. So we think we get external benefits of things like less, sweatshop workers, for example. Again, they can negotiate, and even at their worst, you prevent the worst kinds of producer trade-offs. So then, they don't actually achieve any of their benefits on the economy, not producing any economic harms within that. Now onto liberalization, where this debate really took place. We told you that public backlash to your economic harms was going to pressure these nations to liberalize. They said that illiberal states already would have changed because they've already been largely condemned by Western values. A few reasons why that was such a problematic response. Because no, illiberal states care about protecting their wealth. Why? Because the elites are the ones that control these states. It's the governments, it's the oligarchs in Russia, it's other places and other things in Africa. And so we strike a key tipping point where you hit at the heart of these elites and make them sweat themselves, right? Secondly, we think the middle class, who they're likely to have friends and contacts and just have developed relationships with, or the lower class, right? Likely to have struggled. That strikes a key tipping point because they're likely to care about those people. When you tangibly see them suffer, you're likely to pressure your government to change. Finally, it's just really harmful for asset value at the point at which your entire country has been sanctioned by the rest of the world. You're likely to care about that because oligarchs and these wealthy people in the liberal states care about their own economic productivity. Then on censorship. Obviously, I think that was uniquely to the cherry-picked examples of Russia and China that they want to talk about. Note that that's not actually where most of this debate takes place, as we gave you context right back in Emmanuel. We think it's things like Rwanda, who produce really important diamonds, and Congo, who produce lithium and things like that. Elliot also tells you about how you can just get VPNs in these nations, right? But tangibly, I think you feel a connection when you're in these states to those economic harms, between those economic harms and the atrocities committed. Also, Sophie tells us that they're going to be put behind bars. I think there's huge international backlash at the point at which those kinds of things happen. We told you that oligarchs and cartels likely to also be impacted, not a lot of response there. On government funding, they tell us that vindication, that means that they pour huge amounts of funds in their military. This is what they really pivoted to at their second speech. So let me respond quite clearly here. We think that because these states are so illiberal, they're always on the brink of being like condemned and sanctioned, they're always in fear of invasion, military funding was just intuitively maximized because they constantly felt threats to their sovereignty. That was a disingenuous push in this debate. Gonna have to rethink that one. On illiberal states forming alliances, firstly, we think the US dollar means that it's the main trading currency, so we don't actually think they're likely to want to form illiberal states. Again, like they're more likely to get assets stripped away by other illiberal states because of that. But we tell you, if they want to form alliances with illiberal states, they're obviously likely to do that. I think that all of this is to say that we get far more liberalization. We tell people that what they are going through is not okay. We wake up those communities. Why was that so critical in this debate before that a POI?
So what is your mechanism for how illiberal states won't just team up and form stronger trade relationships with each other?
Well, we told you firstly that the US dollar and like other trading currencies mean that it's incredibly difficult to form those kinds of things. Like the main kinds of trade happens in huge centers in liberal states in places like London and stuff. Secondly, that like it's more likely to get your assets stripped away by illiberal states because they have such shady practices. Finally, if they were going to form alliances, they're already likely to do that. It's a shame I had to repeat those. Okay, why was liberalization so critical then? 4 reasons. Firstly, I think it's an incredibly long-term impact insofar as like scrutiny and the deterrent impact doesn't subside. We win on reversibility. Secondly, you get an incredibly widespread benefit, the point at which you're able to alleviate the suffering of entire communities. Thirdly, it's an incredibly severe impact. What did that look like? It looked like the Yemenis family that gets your house bombed. It looks like the Congolese woman that is now able to have basic rights. These were the crucial things that only we could exclusively get on our side of the house. Finally, we think there was a principal obligation to stand up, and it was abhorrent and deplorable to not intervene in these instances. Finally, on international relations. They tell us that you're going to get less peaceful communication. Obviously, they're already not peacefully communicating with these states anyway. Don't know what they were getting at there. Secondly, on escalation. Obviously, that was only in the specific context of Russia and China. Other places where this debate happened, we already told you about. We don't think that you were necessarily like to escalate conflict when you had like big global superpowers like the USA and Canada, which would like intuitively overpower them. They are also less likely to do that when your government is unstable, your population is economically crippled, and you have no government to function. Proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. I now invite up the third negating speaker to close out their team substantive.
Hello, howdy, good afternoon. I'll take my POIs just as a vigorous way, just really vigorous. The more vigorous, the more likely I am to take it. Okay, thank you. Okay. I don't know if they're like first and third just like really don't like each other or something, but they did not run the same case, right? Like we heard at first that it's going to happen over 3 years. We heard at third it's going to happen over 15 or 20. We heard at first about examples about the Saudi prince. We heard at third that we brought them up. Like, I don't know, maybe you need to go to like therapy. I'm not sure, but okay. Let's just like assume that all of their stuff still applies. With that in mind, like 2 clashes in this debate, right? Firstly, on like economic change, and secondly, on like political change. Well, firstly, we think this whole idea of economic change is like actually the most important point in this debate, right? Like we think political change got a lot more analysis, but we think that like economic change is far more important because like these vague notions of like political change do not matter when families literally cannot afford to put food on the table. Like how much would a dairy farmer care if he loses his job, if he can't afford to feed his family, if like, I don't know, Putin like drops out of power? Like he doesn't care. That's why economic change is the most important thing that people could prove. Okay, what did they tell you? Well, they told you two things. They told you it would happen over a few years, which firstly we say, again, that's like way too fast for a transition. We tell you that markets will completely collapse. And I think their third speaker literally even conceded that when he said that it was too fast of a transition and it wouldn't be happening that quickly. So if you do accept their first speaker, if you do accept their setup and their model before they contradict themselves, then we would win this debate by such a substantial margin I wouldn't even need to be here and speak. But if we like accept their like better case, which is that like it would happen like a more slower transition, like their third speaker said, this still looks like dairy farmers like having to change their jobs because the market structure is completely different, right? Like there's just like no market in the UK for our that sort of like primary produce, right? Like this just proves in the 80s when like Britain just stopped buying all our wool because they weren't interested. Like economy literally nearly collapsed, right? So like we think there's just like no market, so they're still going to have to like change their jobs, change their professions. Our economy is going to like have to like radically shift. And even still, we think that like even if there are like alternatives to things like oil, not just from like Saudi Arabia and stuff, we still think that there's still going to be like a higher pressure, a higher cost, because like these are like the biggest markets, and even if they aren't like the most major markets, there's still going to be far less like oil in the market. So literally all of our stuff that Lily told you still stands, maybe just to like a slightly lesser degree. And that same thing also applies to like trade. All the harms of like slower economic growth because you're not trading with as many countries still applies in this debate. And finally, on like this illiberal countries, they said that like people don't invest in illiberal countries. Well, firstly, I tell you that's like literally false, because like China is like the fastest growing developing country. And like all of this examples, like I'm literally speaking to you from something a US company made in China, like, and stuff like the Shenzhen Valley and like Apple phones. But we also think that they make like this trade-off, like lots of companies are willing to make this trade-off that like they can pay like lower wages in these countries, right? And so like we also think that like illiberal countries, like this idea that illiberal countries are poor already, so we shouldn't care about them, is frankly like completely unfair in this debate, because it's the differences between them being like poor and on the poverty line to literally starving hundreds of families. Okay, so that is why we like win this economic debate, like we win this economic point by like such a big margin, and we win this debate just off that. But onto this idea of like political change. Okay, so like there's a few things to respond with. Like firstly, they try to like nuance their case down the line by like saying that there's like small countries and like big countries. Firstly, we actually like think that a lot of our responses still stand, but we also don't think that small countries are as relevant to this debate, right? Like how much do like liberal countries actually trade with like these small African countries, right? Not much in the first place. So like none of this actually changes much like inside the house. But we also think that like fears of like repercussions from the state if you strike out are actually more prevalent in smaller states, they're smaller illiberal states, because what it looks like is dictators that like you can't just get lost in the crowd in like a smaller state, whereas you can far more in a bigger state, right? And we think that like even if like these ideas of like propaganda and media still are more have greater cut through in these bigger states, we still think that they still have some application in smaller illiberal states. And we also think that the comparative here is that like the political change idea, we actually think that political change, these like the negative impacts that they're trying to like push about like having less money will like force them to change, is actually going to be like more of an impact on these liberal countries for like a couple of reasons. Like firstly, like the illiberal countries will like try and hide like the fact that there's like this change and they're like not trading as much as possible because of the repercussions, because of their Saudi prince example at first, and because of like these liberal countries like transparent, right? All of this material they said now works against them. Okay, but like why does like less money forcing them to change not actually happen anyway in illiberal countries? Well, firstly, like this idea that they'll just like wake up to reality and there's still going to be unrest. Well, firstly, we tell you that like it won't happen, right? Like illiberal actors will just crack down further militarily, right? Putin will just like make sure like hide it even further. That's what happened in East Germany with the Stasi officers. Okay, and like even if like this unrest does happen, we don't think it's going to be like significant, because like what you have to do to topple this like dictator or something, what you have need to do to get rid of Putin is literally cause like a massive overthrow. Like if you wanted to get rid of the Saudi prince, what you are risking is you are having to risk your whole family dying just to like, and yourself dying just to like overthrow them. So we think that like they're like great, we think that they can never actually fully achieve their best case. And even like this idea of like Western countries, we think that like, while this idea of unrest, we don't actually think this unrest actually does anything unless it is like a big thing, right? We think it'll just end up being something like, I don't know, a good example for them would be like something like Tiananmen Square, where it's like a massive a bit of unrest that just like eventually goes away and causes no long-term impacts. But we also think that there's like going to be like far more unrest in the Western countries, which makes it so that all of their policies that they're trying to implement are completely unsustainable, right? It means that they're like unable to apply any pressure on these countries in the long term. It means that liberal countries are just going to break away because their citizens just no longer like them. And it means that like what this looks like is it means that like a dairy farmer who's lost his job is not going to care about like Russia getting rid of Putin, right? Like we think that like these Western countries are far more likely to like drop them anyway. I'll take a PY.
What is more important, a family having marginally more expensive bread or alleviating centuries of abuse in illiberal states?
Well, I think obviously you're trying to say that the second one's important, but I've already proven to you why you'd never get it in the first place. But I also think that the first one, we're talking about people like literally starving here, right? We're talking about people not being able to afford food. Okay, onto the last bit about this and why we actually flipped this political change point. Okay, well, they said that like their whole split was like completely contingent on the fact that like liberal actors, that they get more liberal actors in the world. And Sophie already responded to it, so I don't think I need to. But we also think that we like flip this because we get like soft power. You get like Jacinda Ardern being actually able to go to China and actually be able to go to like cause more change than you could otherwise. And we also think of all the stuff of like a liberal states forming coalitions, right? Like their responses at thirds were batshit, sorry. Like we don't think that anything to do with the US dollar and like asset stripping has literally anything to do with like the Russian and US potentially building up a massive super alliance, right? And we also think that like it still stands, and in fact it makes it far worse. So that is why we win like both points by a profound margin, and we win this debate. Thank you. Proud to stand.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now, as is traditional in schools debating, we will reverse the speaking order. So I ask that the negating team's leaders reply.
Three questions to ask yourself at the end of today's debate. Firstly, what happens to big illiberal superpowers? Secondly, what happens to little illiberal countries who they like somehow wanted to liberalize with no incentive? And thirdly, what happens to liberal countries? Okay. What happens to big liberal superpowers? Note here that they wanted to like kind of remove these people out of the debate because they just didn't think that they would be able to change them anyway. But this is probably something that they always did have to stand up for because they are liberal countries and they have to like just further reduce all of the connections with China. So they are very relevant in today's debate. 4 things we tell you happen here. Firstly, it just gets worse. Why? Because we told you that there's no checks and balances. Then they don't have to appease the like liberal or like Western traders, the people that they're trading with, and therefore they can literally just go and commit every single crime that they want, and they can go and only like ever commit more heinous crimes against the people that they wanted to protect. Secondly, though, liberal countries no longer care about their citizens because they've like suffered their own effects that I'll just unpack later. But this means they're probably just less likely to go and like reach out to like donate to these like causes, or they're more like less likely to do things like housing refugees. Those are probably also concrete harms. Thirdly, they were going to crack down further because they were just so much more like angry and they wanted to like increase their military budget, and that was probably only going to have like really, really bad tangible harms to their citizens on the ground. But then fourthly, it just escalated the whole situation, right? Because look, even if our the response to this was that our like example was niche, even if it's niche that like Russia and China can go and nuke people, that's probably still an incredible harm at the point in time people can die from nuclear fallout, right? That's incredibly harmful, and we're really happy if that's a really, really big benefit, really big harm under their side of the house. That's also still debate losing, even if it's niche, right? Second question, so clearly that means that it only ever got worse for them, and that was really, really important because these are really, really really massive superpowers. Secondly, what happens to these little liberal countries who they want to like liberalize? Look, Cam to start with this really nicely, so I'm not just going to go and like rehash it. But I think we proved that under our side, this was only ever going to be worse under their side of their house. Why? Because these illiberal superpowers are likely to like take them under their wing and trade with them now that they have been like punished and like sanctioned and all of those things, because they're likely to just do things like build infrastructure for them so far like as they traded with them in return. Or then just going to like only have other liberal tradings or countries trading together. And also the second reason for this that we told you was that it's just so much harder to change their ideals. So all the countries with the same ideals who have been told that their ideals are wrong are just going to all group together because that's just the natural thing to do. What this does is proves that like all of these countries are not going to be liberalized because look, the like liberalized countries do not have the incentive to like trade with them. Because why? We told you that our biggest, like probably the biggest harm under today's debate was probably what happened to liberal countries. Because why? Note that everything I just told you was things that they had to win today's debate. Look, all we had to do, we didn't even have to win any of that to win today's debate because we told you it was so much worse for what happens to liberal countries. But look, even so far as you were like a little bit confused as to whether we washed out most of the material and we mitigated that even slightly, then we win today's debate. Why? Because we told you at the point in time where these liberal countries are making such extreme sacrifices for people that like are going to have no tangible change anyway, then that was always going to be debate winning for us. Why? Because you are literally talking about young single mothers being able to feed their children. They're having to choose between like which child they're going to like put school shoes on that morning so they can go to school, because that was such a significant harm for their side, because because the comparison that they gave you is that they wanted us to be like these liberal countries to be trading with countries that like have far less resources, and that was always going to mean that there were like such terrible flow-on effects. But it was also talking about the producers and the exporters in our countries, right? Because now you're like leaving whole communities who are really vulnerable with absolutely no means of money, because they told you that you can just like trade like with it internally. But look, when you've got massive markets like China who are like 50% of New Zealand's trade, that's probably something that you probably can never replicate, even if you give them a 15 years time span. What that meant is you're literally leaving people with absolutely no money under our side of the house. We told you that was significant enough of a harm on its own. But look, at the point in time where they're not even getting the impacts they want in that trade-off, they could never have won today's debate. That is why I'm incredibly proud to stand.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that speech. I now invite up the final speech of today's debate, Affirmative Leaders reply.
When the USA is selling more weapons to Saudi Arabia than any other country in the world, and Saudi Arabia is using those weapons to bomb people in Yemen, we think that's probably pretty problematic in this debate. Today, I think it's really key for side neg to engage us on the front of small countries, because we were never claiming that we were going to swing Russia and China. We were saying our biggest impacts were on countries like Saudi Arabia, countries like Pakistan, small African nations, right, that were illiberal. But we still probably undermine these nations. I'm going to prove that to you today. So what am I going to do for you? Firstly, going to prove why we get our thrust on liberalization of these nations. Secondly, deal with how we took out their case material in this debate. Thirdly, I'm going to explain to you the other parts of the victory, which is completely unresponded to by them. What's our thrust on prop today? We tell you, firstly, we liberalize actors because of economic pressures and stuff. We hear two responses out of their bench. Firstly, we hear that we're going to harm the economy. Firstly, we hear that we're going to harm the economy, right? To harm the economy. And what the problem with that is they say, the propaganda will just blame this all on the West, right? I tell you a couple of responses to that. Firstly, the internet circumvents this to some extent, and this doesn't really exist in small nations. We tell you nations like outside of like the Russia and China actors, they don't have these mitigation mechanisms because they don't have like huge teams to surveil the network, right? Secondly, they tell us that crackdowns like in Tiananmen Square will mean that this doesn't actually have any impact on the debate. We have a couple of responses to that. Firstly, we think in smaller countries, it's much harder to have these huge crackdowns because you don't have as large a military to shut down these protests. Secondly, we think you literally only need one protest to overthrow the government to work, and then you win, right? Just because it didn't work in Tiananmen Square, just because it doesn't work in the next one, right? You only need one of them to work, and we achieve all of our benefits in this debate. They say then, we hear from OP, they say that Xi Jinping and like Putin are going to hate us because of this, right? We told you they already hate us. Like Russia isn't like, we love the West so much, right? They're already pushing this propaganda. They're already pushing this hateful content, right? If they had the opportunity, they would screw over the West, right? So all these harms accrue on both sides of the house. Next, we hear from Op, they're like, but we're very reliant on Russia, on China, right? We told you, like, this doesn't exist with small economies, right? That we're actually engaging in this debate. But two reasons to engage with that material we gave you. Firstly, we told you that firstly, if you wanted to respond to like the fact they said it's not as affordable as Canada. We told you at second, yes, that's because they don't use human labor. They don't abuse human rights, right? We tell you that was a massive harm. They failed to respond to on their side of the house. We also said that this was going to be mitigated by the economic growth we were able to prove on our side because of the benefits it's going to accrue. Engage with that later in my leaders. Thirdly, they wanted to tell us. Thirdly, we told them that when we cut away from like Russia, when Russia cuts away from us, that's even worse, right? At least we can control it on our side. At least we can ease out the benefits. But when Russia or China or these other countries are making like that quick cutoff, it's even more detrimental because you're unable to respond. Then offer like, yes, but liberal nations aren't going to follow us. We gave you 3 reasons. We told you domestic human rights pressure. We told you united voting blocs in the UN and other institutions. We told you liberal actors are also going to get a key economic benefit. Finally, they're like, yes, but Putin and these large people aren't going to be impacted. We're like, yes, but oligarchs and other people are going to be pressured. We tell you the diamond cartels in states in Africa are going to be pressured, right? We tell you, although the debate was like small impact for places like China and stuff, this still shows we still got an impact on them, right? Look, we're able to win on the Russia and China front, even if our benefits are slightly marginalized by their case material. What we're actually able to accrue our biggest benefits on in our debate winning material today is the fact that we're able to swing small nations because we're able to pressure them with these large countries, these large voting blocs. They're very reliant on these economies, right? We tell you, also, we get no response to our material on the benefits we bring to liberal actors. Like, look, we hear a bit of implicit material from them, but we engage with that case material. We give you lots of responses at third, just to like pick one of the good ones out of that case material. We tell you the markets increase because although New Zealand's like not shipping China to dairy, right? UK's not importing dairy from Russia now. So you like shift around the resources and you just reallocate them in the countries. You just slightly turn down globalization a little bit. We also prove this is a benefit. We just like to also flag that we hear no response to our war reduction point we bring out in a second. They had 2 speakers to respond to that. We hear no responses. That's also a part of it. If you believe we achieve any of those 3 things in this debate, we're able to win today.